Hey friends, how we doing? So in my last video I talked about the first 3 tarot books I encountered, and I mentioned the 3 books I'm about to talk about. This will likely be a much shorter video, although who knows. But these were 3 influential books that sort of came next. The first ones that I mentioned were primers. They were gateway drugs, for lack of a more appropriate expression, and these took me further into the study. Tarot Spells, but Janina Renee wrote Everyday Tarot, which is another book that I mentioned in the last video. This was sort of, so one thing that kind of quickly happened as I accessed tarot for the first time was I also accessed things outside of my Catholicism. Now, when I was 17, I sort of came out to myself after having fallen in love with a guy who turned out to be gay, but not particularly in love with me. But it was a moment where I had a real sort of like breaking dawn moment with my Catholicism. And shortly thereafter discovered tarot. And through that discovered, because of the array of particularly neo-pagan themed decks at the time, Scott Cunningham and other pagan thinkers, and discovered that there was something to be said for taking a more active role in your own life. And so shortly after learning tarot, I started reading Scott Cunningham's books. To this day, Scott Cunningham's Living Wicca and Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, aside from, you know, just generalized, you know, I mean, there have been many influences on my cosmology, including Thich Nhat Hanh, Pema Chodron, etc. But Scott Cunningham, Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, there was just a open, gentle, natural, nature-based kindness in his books that kind of blew me away, and that was so foreign to me from the sort of exclusionary moments of my own upbringing's religion. But that opened me up to more things, and so from there came my experience with Tarot Spells. It's a really good book. I honestly have not revisited this since God, when I was 21 or 22. When did this book come out even? 1990. So I encountered this probably in 2001, which was the 17th printing, according to this. So it had been around for a minute. It was a really interesting experience, and I said this in my last video on this. I did a tarot spell about buying a car, and I needed a car at that point, and I did, and it worked. And so this book kind of blew me away. It was illustrated with a Robin Wood tarot, which is a really beautiful deck, aside from 1 or 2 cards. It has one of my favorite magicians ever, because he's smoking. But it was a good book, and it was like, oh, when I did that first experience, when I did the spell about buying a car, it was like, oh fuck, like I mean, who knows if that was why I bought a car that day, but it was like, shit, you know what I mean? Like, action is different than passivity. So it was really interesting. Looking at this book makes me nostalgic. It makes me nostalgic for the late 90s, early 2000s world of tarot and Llewellyn and the books they were publishing, and my early days with the American Tarot Association and whatnot. Like, this is a real sort of emotionally strange walk down memory lane, but this was a book that really, really had an effect on me. Mary K. Greer's Tarot for Yourself, both of the next 2 books, I think, have newer editions. These are my original editions, and I think these were new editions at the time. This was another workbook that taught me a lot about not just reading, but doing. And it's funny, I didn't do all the activities in here, but I did a lot of them, and some of them I actually did here. It's funny to see sort of my, 21-year-old handwriting, and to you see the mess I made. But again, this was another thing that inspired Tarot on Earth. And it's just a really good book. I think it's the first thing I recommend when people say, how do you learn to read for yourself? Because it lets you dig in. So this was the second edition. I think there's a third edition out now. It's just such a good book, a workbook for personal transformation. There's a part of me, and actually one thing that reminded me of this book recently was Benabel Wen did a video about it. There's a part of me that wants to sort of go back to one and work my way through this book, and maybe I will, because last year was not my favorite year, and the last few months I felt sort of disconnected from reading in a way, and so maybe Mary K. Greer can guide me through that cloud. I did get to say hello to Mary K. Greer and tell her what a fan I was last year at the Reader's Studio, which I did not have the courage to do to the other two presenters, which were Benabel and Rachel Pollack. And although I have had a few conversations with the amazingly generous and smart and funny Benabel Wen since, but yeah, so I just happened to be standing with someone talking to them when Mary K. Greer came over, and I had a moment to gush. Such a good book, just so good, And then there's 78 Degrees of Wisdom, which did recently get a new edition. My copy of this book is literally falling apart. Originally published in 2 volumes. I've talked about this book before. I love it so much. I love really all of Rachel Pollack's books. As I was pulling out books, these 3, there was Tarot Wisdom and Through the Forest of Souls, and another book by another author, and I thought, I should pull those out too, because those were really formative. But these videos, this video in particular was meant to be brief. The last one was meant to be about half as long as it was too, but that's generally my MO. This book is so good. It was just starting from her monologue at the beginning about how she encountered tarot, like that chapter about her origin story is one I return to often. It just lights me up. There's something so great about, her interest in the cards and getting a reading and trying to find a deck and being in Plattsburgh, New York, and then eventually teaching for a Berlioz school and doing a reading, and just, oh my God, there's just, what's brilliant about this book has lasted for a reason. There are other books that did a similar format beforehand, and certainly many books have aped this format since, and I think Rachel Pollack, talks about having been influenced by Eden Gray. But there's something so personal and rooted and deep and connected about 78 Degrees of Wisdom. There's something so exceptionally connected that there's an electric current running between the Rachel Pollack who wrote this book. God, I don't even know. I mean, 1980 and 2019. You still feel the energy of the Rachel that wrote this in 1980 and the one talking today and the one on these pages. And I return to this book a lot for just the joy. It's so beat up, it's so yellowed, it's like the binding is cracked, and I love it so much. A new edition just came out, and I thought about buying it, but like I would only do that if this completely disintegrated. I love this book so much. If the 3 that I mentioned in my first video lit the match, this was the one that lit the candle and the lamp. It just lit me up. It's so good. It's such a good book. I don't read necessarily as I did when I was reading this book. A lot has changed since I encountered 78 Degrees of Wisdom, probably in 2002 or 2003 is my guess. but it's still a touchstone. And I have such reverence, I mean, people call this the Bible of Tarot in a lot of ways, sort of jokingly, but it kind of is, because of its metaphysical joy. I don't know how to describe it differently. It's so good. And her other books are so good too. Through the Forest of Souls was in a way what was the inspiration for the book I'm working on now, because Through the Forest of Souls is really a collection of essays and meditations on tarot. And my new book is essentially going to be a collection of essays and meditations on tarot. Different, but entirely prompted by that method. Tarot Wisdom is such a good book. It's in a way more connected to how I read than 78 Degrees of Wisdom is, but I just love this book so much. And she's such a good writer, and there's so much like wisdom and genius in her work, and in all of this. In all of these three books. Tarot for Yourself is such a good book, so worth connecting to, and so worth... It's a workshop, it's something you engage in. 78 Degrees of Wisdom sort of washes over you. So where, like, Tarot for Yourself is a class you participate in, 78 Degrees of Wisdom is a guided meditation that you lay back and rest within. So good. So those are my next three. There are many books I've read over the years that I love, many who have, there's Robert M. Place's books, there are Wald and Ruth Amberstone, I cannot speak, Wald and Ruth Ann Amberstone's books, both tarot tips and tarot symbolism. Amazing. There's so many good books that have, erupted into the world. These are just the 6 that were formative, and I'm happy to share them with you. So again, like I said in the first video, I hope this was interesting. I hope it was fun and that you enjoyed it. I think certainly these 3 books are exponentially better than the first 2 I shared in my last video. But it's just fun. It's fun to learn where we came from and revisit where we came from as we're thinking about where we're going. And these books did that. So that's my thoughts. Those are my sort of first 6 entry points into tarot. Love to hear what yours are. Just super curious. And be well. And I hope you enjoyed this and have a lovely evening.